All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking some absolutely fascinating research by Dr. Cory Clark. She's looking into these hidden demographic shifts and, frankly, massive value clashes that are quietly but fundamentally transforming the entire scientific world. We're going to see how the actual physical makeup of our academic institutions is literally changing the kind of science that gets published, the questions researchers are even allowed to ask, and ultimately, how society understands truth itself. So here's our roadmap for today. We've got 5 main stops. First up, the gender bias flip. Then, academia's demographic shift. Third, we'll look at truth versus harm reduction. Fourth, the evolutionary psychology taboo. And we'll wrap up with the crisis of self-censorship. Let's get into it. Section 1, the gender bias flip. Let's kick things off by challenging a pretty widely held assumption about societal bias. And we're going to use some genuinely surprising data straight from the research to do it. Think about this. If you go on Google Scholar right now, a search for the term misogyny pulls up roughly 114,000 results. But misandry? Just 2,340. That is a staggering gap, right? And it really perfectly illustrates Dr. Clark's observation that mainstream narratives and academic research focus almost exclusively on anti-female bias. The general assumption is just that society is inherently biased against women, so researchers naturally spend a massive amount of time investigating that specific angle. But as you'll see, the actual data tells a much more nuanced story. Because despite public perception, the data actually shows that hiring biases completely reversed around the year 2009. Now, most people just assume there's this massive ongoing discrimination against women in hiring, especially in male stereotypical jobs like the STEM fields. But actual audit studies? They show the bias has flipped to heavily favor women across a whole bunch of domains. And yet, everyday people and even academics kind of just keep assuming the exact opposite is happening. Moving on to Section 2, academia's demographic shift. So, how did we get here? To understand what caused this massive cultural shift in how we perceive and conduct science, we really have to look at a huge demographic ripple effect inside higher education. It's like a wave. Let's trace how this builds over time. Higher ed institutions were, once run almost entirely by men. But sequentially, they have completely transformed. First, women became the dominating majority at the undergraduate level. Then, that demographic wave rolled into the graduate student level. And now, there are actually more women who are faculty members as well. You're looking at an institution that has fundamentally changed its gender composition from the ground up. Which brings us to Section 3, truth versus harm reduction. This is where we hit a profound philosophical conflict highlighted by Dr. Clark's research. It's basically the collision of 2 very different evolutionary priorities that are battling for the soul of academia right now. Evolutionary psychology suggests that, historically speaking, men formed coalitions that demanded objective truth and hierarchy, basically to ensure the group's survival. Women, on the flip side, evolved a different primary focus, prioritizing the protection of the vulnerable, specifically offspring, and favoring egalitarianism to keep the whole community safe. Dr. Clark's research argues that this fundamental evolutionary difference is literally shaping science itself today. Men tend to be more interested in advancing what is empirically correct, regardless of people's feelings, while women are relatively more interested in advancing what is morally desirable and, above all, harmless. Let's actually look at how this plays out in the hard data. When surveyed about protecting students from offensive ideas, a majority of men, 56%, say no, but a strong majority of women, 64%, say yes. And this divide, it holds true across the board. Take disinviting speakers who threaten violent protest. Men lean toward no at 51%, while the solid 67% of women say yes. How about prioritizing free speech over an inclusive society? 71% of men say yes, but 60% of women say no. The survey data makes this divide undeniable. Think about it. When you completely change the majority representation in an institution, like we just saw, the prevailing institutional value mathematically has to shift. In this case, it shifted away from raw academic freedom and heavily toward preventing harm. All right, Section 4, the evolutionary psychology taboo. This value clash we're talking about, it creates some incredibly strict taboos around certain scientific disciplines, specifically the ones that might produce uncomfortable truths. To really get why this is so controversial, we first need to define the very field that often produces conclusions clashing with those harm reduction goals. Evolutionary psychology. Put simply, this is the study of human behavior and psychological traits as the direct product of evolutionary pressures. It essentially looks at how our deep past shaped our current brains and bodies. Make sense? Now, when evolutionary psychology meets the new harm reduction culture of modern academia, certain data-driven conclusions end up being heavily suppressed. According to Dr. Clark's interviews with psychology professors, findings stating that biological sex is a binary, or that men and women evolve different psychological characteristics, or that gender bias isn't the primary driver of the gender gap in STEM, these are totally taboo. And here is the kicker. They're suppressed not necessarily because the data is wrong, but because the findings themselves are perceived as morally dangerous or potentially harmful to vulnerable groups. Which leads us to our final part, Section 5, the crisis of self-censorship. This brings us to the downstream consequence of this entire culture shift, and it's a big one. A massive wave of fear and self-censorship among actual practicing scientists. When Dr. Clark surveyed hundreds of psychology professors, she asked them a very direct, pointed question about pursuing unpopular research. She asked, should scholars be punished for controversial conclusions? The answers were starkly, and I mean revealingly, divided by demographics. Just look at this data. 60% of male academics outright say, no, scholars should not be punished. Period. Meanwhile, 60% of female academics say, well, it's complicated. The data clearly shows that female psychology professors are significantly more likely to support ostracizing peers, not hiring them, or even retracting their published papers if their empirical conclusions are viewed as morally problematic. So moral concerns are heavily influencing the willingness to accept scientific data. In this environment creates what researchers call the illusion of consensus. Dr. Clark's research reveals something wild. A lot of academics actually believe these taboo evolutionary findings are empirically true. But because researchers are just terrified of losing their jobs, or facing social media mobs, or having their papers retracted, they stay completely silent. This self-censorship falsely makes controversial scientific realities look like totally fringe ideas to the general public, when in fact they're widely believed behind closed doors. It's a phenomenon perfectly captured by the concept of preference falsification. This occurs when people publicly say that they believe or support something that they don't actually truly believe, just to protect themselves. And this highlights a huge institutional vulnerability. When researchers outwardly support a scientific consensus that they privately dispute, it threatens to deeply undermine the public's trust in science as a whole. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. Dr. Clark's research suggests that prioritizing immediate emotional comfort might actually cause worse harm down the road, simply by destroying our ability to accurately perceive the world. So ask yourself, if avoiding potential harm means we have to suppress empirical facts, what is the ultimate purpose of science? If truth directly conflicts with moral comfort, which one will our civilization choose to survive? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helps map out the hidden forces shifting our academic landscape today.